The ceremony was supposed to be routine, a standard palace event with all the usual protocol. Lines of royal guards standing at attention, family members arriving in perfect order, cameras positioned at every angle to capture the moment. But something went wrong. Not catastrophically wrong. Not the kind of mistake that makes headlines immediately, but the kind that ripples outward slowly, like a stone dropped in still water. It started with a bow lieutenant. James Hartley had been a royal guard for 8 years. He knew the rules, knew them better than he knew his own reflection. Every gesture had meaning. Every movement was prescribed. You didn't improvise. You didn't personalize. You simply followed protocol. That morning, he stood in formation with his fellow guards along the palace corridor. The family was arriving for a memorial service. Solemn, formal, every detail planned. Down to the second, Queen Camilla arrived first, moving down the corridor with measured steps. Her expression was composed, regal. She wore black, as expected, with pearls at her throat. James and the other guards snapped to attention. They bowed in perfect unison as she passed. Heads tilted at exactly 15 degrees. Held for precisely 3 seconds, then up again. Textbook Camilla barely glanced at them. She moved past like water flowing around stones. Expected, unremarkable. Then Princess Kate arrived. She walked more slowly than Camilla had. Her eyes were red, though she'd clearly tried to hide it with makeup. She carried herself with the same formal grace, but there was something softer about her. Something human. The guards prepared to bow again. Same angle, same timing, same mechanical precision. But James didn't do what he was supposed to do. He bowed deeper, not dramatically. Not in a way that most people would even notice, but deep enough that it meant something. Deep enough that it showed respect that went beyond protocol. Deep enough that the guard standing next to him shot him a quick, confused glance. If you're captivated by this story, make sure to subscribe so you never miss another powerful true tale like this one, Kate noticed. Her eyes found James as she passed. For just a moment, their gazes met. Hers filled with surprise and something else. Gratitude? Maybe. Or a recognition that someone had seen her as more than just a title. She gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible, then continued walking. James straightened, his heart pounding harder than it should have been. It was just a bow. Just a gesture. Nothing that should matter, but it did, because in the palace, everything mattered. Every action was observed. Every deviation from protocol was noted. And what James had just done, intentionally or not, was make a choice. He'd shown preference. The ceremony proceeded without incident. Hymns were sung, prayers were offered. The family sat in their designated positions. Grief contained within the bounds of royal dignity. James stood at his post throughout, barely breathing. His mind replayed the moment over and over. The bow, Kate's eyes. The guard beside him who'd noticed. Had anyone else seen? After the service ended, James returned to the guard's quarters to change out of his ceremonial uniform. The room was buzzing with quiet conversation. Men discussing the event, the attendees, the usual post-ceremony observations. Marcus, the guard who'd been standing beside James, appeared at his locker. That was an interesting choice out there, Marcus said quietly. James kept his expression neutral. I don't know what you mean, the bow Marcus pressed. You went deeper for Princess Catherine. I bowed appropriately for both members of the royal family, James replied, his voice steady. Marcus studied him for a long moment. I hope for your sake that's what the surveillance review shows. James's blood went cold. Surveillance, of course. Every corridor was monitored. Every angle captured. If anyone reviewed the footage and compared his bows side by side, I followed protocol, James said firmly. Marcus shrugged. If you say so. He walked away, leaving James standing alone by his locker. James's hand shook slightly as he unbuttoned his jacket. He hadn't planned it, hadn't thought about it. The deeper bow had been instinctive, natural, a response to seeing genuine emotion in Kate's eyes, to recognizing her humanity in a place where humanity was often hidden beneath ceremony. But intent didn't matter here. Only perception did. And if someone perceived him as showing favoritism, as making a political statement, as choosing one royal over another, ... James sat down heavily on the bench, his uniform jacket hanging loose from his shoulders. What had he done? That evening, James was summoned to Captain Reynolds' office. The captain was a stern man in his 60s who'd served the palace for over 3 decades. He sat behind his desk, hands folded, expression unreadable. "Sit down, Lieutenant," Reynolds said. James sat, his spine rigid, his face carefully blank. Reynolds studied him for a long moment. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut. Finally, the captain spoke. "I've reviewed the footage from this morning's ceremony." James's heart hammered against his ribs. He said nothing. Reynolds leaned back in his chair. "Your conduct was ... noticed." "Sir," Reynolds held up a hand. "Let me finish." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The question isn't whether you deviated from standard protocol. The question is why." James met his captain's gaze directly. "I showed respect, sir." "Nothing more." "Respect," Reynolds repeated slowly. Interesting word choice. Another long silence. Then Reynolds leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. "Lieutenant Hartley, do you understand what you've done?" James swallowed hard. "I bowed to a member of the royal family, sir." "You made a statement," Reynolds corrected, "whether you meant to or not." And in that moment, James realized his captain was right. He'd made a choice. And that choice would have consequences. Captain Reynolds stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. For a long moment, he simply stared out at the palace grounds. "How long have you been with us, Hartley?" he asked, without turning around. 8 years, sir." 8 years, Reynolds repeated. "Good record. No disciplinary issues. Commendations for conduct during state visits. You've been reliable." "Thank you, sir." Reynolds turned to face him. "Which makes this all the more puzzling. You know the rules. You know how carefully we must remain neutral? Especially now." James understood what he meant. Especially now, when tensions between different members of the royal family were the subject of constant media speculation. When every gesture was analyzed, every interaction dissected. "It meant no disrespect to Her Majesty," James said carefully. "But you showed more respect to Princess Catherine," Reynolds countered. "Whether intentional or not, that's how it will be interpreted." James's jaw tightened. He wanted to argue, to explain that Kate's grief had simply moved him, that he'd responded as a human being, not just as a guard. But he knew it wouldn't matter in this world. Being human was often seen as a weakness. Reynolds returned to his desk and sat down. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to file this as a minor protocol deviation. A momentary lapse in judgment brought on by the emotional nature of the ceremony. You'll receive a written warning in your file, and we'll move forward." Relief flooded through James.
AQ.
"Sir," but Reynolds continued, his voice hardening. "If something like this happens again, the consequences will be much more severe. Am I understood?" "Perfectly, sir." Reynolds dismissed him with a wave. James stood, saluted, and walked toward the door. Just as he reached it, the captain spoke again. "Hartley." "What?" James paused and turned back. Reynolds' expression had softened slightly. "Between you and me, I understand why you did it. But understanding doesn't change the rules." James nodded once, then left the office. As he walked back through the palace corridors, his mind churned. He'd been given a reprieve, a warning shot across the bow. He should feel grateful, relieved instead. He felt conflicted. Because the truth was, if faced with the same situation again, he wasn't sure he'd do anything differently. Over the next few days, James noticed subtle changes. Other guards looked at him differently. Some with curiosity, some with disapproval, a few with something that might have been respect. Word had spread, as it always did in the close-knit world of the palace staff. The guard who bowed deeper for Kate, some saw it as favoritism, others as a breach of protocol, and a few saw it as something else entirely. As a quiet statement of solidarity with a woman many staff members genuinely admired, James tried to keep his head down, to do his job without drawing attention, but he could feel eyes on him constantly, watching, judging, wondering what he would do next. A week after the incident, James was assigned to corridor duty during a private family meeting. He and 3 other guards stood at attention while various family members arrived. When Kate approached, James felt his pulse quicken. She was alone this time, walking with purpose, her expression focused but kind as always. As she passed, James bowed. Exactly 15 degrees. Exactly 3 seconds. Textbook protocol. She glanced at him briefly but didn't pause, didn't acknowledge him, just continued walking. It felt wrong, hollow, like he'd somehow betrayed something by following the rules. 20 minutes later, Camilla arrived for the same meeting. James bowed again. Same angle, same duration. Camilla didn't look at him at all. After both women had entered the meeting room and the doors closed, Marcus stepped closer to James. "Nice discipline today," he said quietly. James said nothing. "Must have been hard, though," Marcus continued. "Going against your instincts." "I don't have instincts," James replied flatly. "I have training." Marcus smiled slightly. "If you say so." That evening, James returned to his small apartment outside the palace grounds. He lived alone, by choice. The job demanded so much that relationships were difficult to maintain. Most of his friendships had faded over the years, replaced by professional acquaintances and duty rosters. He made himself dinner, ate without tasting it, and sat on his couch staring at nothing. His phone buzzed. A message from his sister Rachel. She lived in Edinburgh with her family. They spoke occasionally, though not as often as they should. The message was simple. "Saw something interesting in the news. A story about palace guards and protocol. Made me think of you. Everything okay?" James stared at the message. The story hadn't made major headlines, but apparently it had gotten out. Someone had talked. Someone always talked. He typed back, "Everything's fine. Just doing my job." Rachel's response came quickly. "You always were terrible at lying." James smiled despite himself. She knew him too well. His phone rang. "Rachel," he hesitated, then answered. "I'm fine, really," he said before she could ask. "Tell me what happened," she said gently. So he did. He told her about the ceremony. About the bow. About Kate's eyes meeting his. About the warning from Captain Reynolds. About feeling caught between what was right and what was required. Rachel listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Do you regret it?" she finally asked. James thought about the question. Really thought about it. "No," he admitted. "I don't." "Then why do you sound so miserable?" "Because now I have to spend every day pretending I do," James said quietly. "I have to bow the same way to everyone. Show the same face. Be the same perfect, neutral soldier. Even when everything inside me is screaming that it's wrong." "What's wrong about it?" Rachel asked. "Treating people like titles instead of humans," James said. "Following rules that require us to show equal respect to people who aren't equally deserving of it." He stopped, shocked by his own words. He'd never said that out loud before. Never even fully admitted it to himself. "Maybe it's time to think about whether this is really the right place for you." "I've given 8 years to this," James protested. "My whole adult life." "I know," Rachel said. "But what's it cost you?" After they hung up, James sat in the darkness of his apartment, his sister's question echoing in his mind. What had it cost him? His individuality, his freedom to choose, his ability to act on conscience instead of protocol. But was that too high a price? James didn't have an answer. Not yet. But he was starting to realize that the question itself was dangerous, because once you started asking it, you couldn't stop. 3 weeks passed. James fell back into routine. Stand at attention. Bow when appropriate. Maintain perfect neutrality. He was a model guard again. Nothing to question. Nothing to notice. But inside, something had shifted. He found himself watching Kate more carefully when she passed. Not inappropriately. Not in a way that crossed lines. but with attention that went beyond professional duty. He noticed things he'd never paid attention to before. The way she always took time to speak with staff members, even when running late. How she remembered names and asked about families. The genuine warmth in her eyes that never seemed forced or calculated. He noticed other things too. The way some palace officials treated her with barely concealed disdain. How certain staff members whispered when she passed. The subtle ways she was excluded from conversations and decisions, and he noticed how she handled it all with grace that seemed almost impossible. James wasn't supposed to notice these things. Wasn't supposed to care. He was meant to be a piece of furniture, present but invisible. Serving without judgment, but he couldn't unknow what he'd learned. Couldn't unfeel what he'd felt. One morning, James was assigned to escort duty. A simple task: walk several paces behind a royal family member as they moved from one part of the palace to another. Provide security. Maintain distance. The assignment was for Kate. She was heading to a meeting with one of her charitable foundations. James fell into step behind her, his movements automatic. They walked in silence through the long corridors. Portraits of ancestors stared down from the walls. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting shadows on marble floors. Halfway to their destination, Kate stopped suddenly. James stopped as well, immediately alert. His hand moved instinctively toward his radio. He was ready to call for backup if there was a threat. But Kate just stood there, looking at a portrait on the wall. It showed a queen from centuries ago. Someone long dead and mostly forgotten.
Oh.
Do you ever wonder what they thought? Kate asked softly. James was startled. Royals rarely spoke to guards directly during duty hours. They existed in parallel worlds that only occasionally intersected, ma'am, he said carefully. Kate gestured to the portrait. All these people, looking down at us? Do you think they judged each other this harshly? Or is that something modern? James didn't know how to answer. This felt like dangerous territory. Personal conversation that blurred professional lines, but Kate turned to look at him, and her expression held genuine curiosity. Not the kind that demanded performance. Just honest interest. I think people have always been complicated, ma'am, James said slowly. Every generation probably thought theirs was the most difficult. Kate smiled slightly. That's a diplomatic answer. I'm a diplomatic person, ma'am, she laughed. Actually laughed. The sound was unexpected and warm. No, you're not. James felt his cheeks flush. Ma'am, the ceremony, Kate interrupted gently. 3 weeks ago, I noticed what you did. James's heart stopped. He'd hoped she'd forgotten, that it had been too subtle to register, that he'd imagined the connection between them. I followed protocol, ma'am, he said automatically. No, Kate said quietly. You followed your heart. There's a difference. They stood in the corridor, the morning light filtering between them. James knew he should end this conversation. Should remind her politely that they needed to continue to her meeting. Should return to being invisible. Instead, he spoke the truth. You looked like you needed kindness that day, ma'am. Not just protocol. Kate's eyes filled with tears. She blinked them back quickly, but not before James saw. Thank you, she whispered. You have no idea how much that meant. Then she turned and continued walking. James followed, maintaining the proper distance, his heart pounding in his chest. They reached the meeting room. Kate entered. The door closed. James took up his post outside, but everything had changed. That evening, James was called to Captain Reynolds' office again. His stomach sank as he walked down the familiar corridor. What had he done now? Had someone seen the conversation? Reported it as inappropriate. He knocked and entered at Reynolds' command. The captain sat at his desk, but this time, he wasn't alone. Commander Patricia Walsh stood beside him. She was head of palace security, James's superior. He'd met her exactly twice in 8 years. This was bad, Lieutenant Hartley, Commander Walsh said. Her voice was neutral but firm. Please, Sid. James sat, his mind racing through possibilities. Was he being dismissed? Reassigned? Investigated? Walsh studied him for a long moment. You've become quite the topic of conversation lately. James said nothing. The bow at the memorial service. Your assignment today with Princess Catherine? There are people watching you very carefully, Lieutenant. I've done nothing wrong, James said, haven't you? Walsh asked. You've shown preference. Made judgments about which members of the royal family deserve what kind of respect? You've crossed lines. I've treated everyone with respect, James countered, his voice steady despite the fear crawling up his spine. Equal respect? Walsh pressed. James hesitated. That was the trap. If he said yes, he'd be lying. If he said no, he'd be admitting to exactly what they were accusing him of. Captain Reynolds spoke up. Commander, if I may. Lieutenant Hartley has served honorably for 8 years. One minor deviation doesn't... It's not about one deviation, Walsh interrupted. It's about what that deviation represents. We cannot have guards choosing sides, making personal judgments, acting on emotion instead of protocol. She turned back to James. So I'm going to ask you directly. If given the choice, which member of the royal family would you prefer to serve? The question hung in the air like a blade. James knew the right answer. The safe answer. The answer that would protect his career and keep him in position. He should say he had no preference. That all royals were equal in his eyes. That he served the crown, not individuals, but sitting there, facing 2 superior officers, knowing his career might end in the next 10 seconds. James found he couldn't lie. Princess Catherine. Ma'am, the silence that followed was deafening. Reynolds's face went pale. Walsh's expression remained neutral, but something flickered behind her eyes. Why? Walsh asked simply. Because she treats people like they matter, James said quietly. Because she sees the staff, remembers names, shows genuine kindness. Because when she walks through these halls, she makes them feel less cold. He paused, then continued. And because I believe she represents what this institution should be. Not what it has been, but what it could become. Walsh studied him for what felt like an eternity. Then she stood. You're dismissed, Lieutenant. James stood as well, his legs unsteady. Am I being removed from duty, ma'am? Walsh walked to the window, her back to him. Not yet. But you're on very thin ice, Lieutenant Hartley. And the ice is cracking. James saluted, even though she couldn't see it. Then he left the office, his heart hammering, his future suddenly uncertain. He'd told the truth, and truth in this place was often the most dangerous thing of all. The following week, James noticed he was being reassigned more frequently. Never to the same detail twice. Never with the same team. It was subtle, but deliberate. He was being kept off balance, monitored, tested. He no longer received assignments involving Kate. Instead, he found himself stationed at distant gates, patrolling empty corridors during night shifts, standing guard over storage rooms that required no guarding. It was punishment disguised as duty rotation. Marcus found him during one such shift. Stationed outside a maintenance wing at 2 a.m. Rough assignment, Marcus said. Appearing from the shadows, it's fine, James replied flatly. You know why you're here, right? Marcus leaned against the wall. They're trying to make you quit. Push you to the edges until you decide it's not worth it. I know what they're doing, and you're going to stay anyway. It wasn't a question. James didn't answer. Marcus shook his head. You're stubborn. I'll give you that. He paused. But you should know something. You're not alone in how you feel. James looked at him sharply. What? About Princess Catherine, Marcus clarified quietly. A lot of the staff feel the same way. They just don't say it out loud. Too risky. Then why are you saying it? Marcus smiled slightly. Because someone has to. And because what you did took guts. Stupid guts? Maybe. But guts nonetheless. After Marcus left, James stood alone in the empty corridor, processing this information. He'd assumed he was isolated, that his feelings were unique, that he'd been the only one foolish enough to let emotion override. Protocol, but maybe he'd been wrong. Over the next several days, James began to notice small things. A housekeeper who smiled at him warmly in passing, a senior aide who held a door open for him longer than necessary, A kitchen staff member who slipped him an extra pastry during breakfast. Tiny gestures. Barely noticeable, but meaningful. They were showing him he had allies. 2 weeks after his meeting with Commander Walsh, James was finally assigned back to corridor duty during a state dinner. Not a prestigious position, but at least he was back inside the main palace. He stood at attention as guests arrived. Dignitaries, politicians, foreign royals, all dressed in their finest, dripping with medals and jewels. Kate arrived with Prince William. She looked stunning in a deep green gown, her hair swept up elegantly. But James noticed the tension in her shoulders. The careful smile that didn't quite reach her eyes as she passed. She glanced at him. Just for a second. Their eyes met. She didn't nod, didn't smile. But something passed between them. Recognition, acknowledgement. Then she was gone. Disappearing into the grand hall, Camilla arrived 15 minutes later. She moved with regal authority, her presence commanding attention. Cameras flashed. Officials bowed deeply. James bowed as well. Perfect protocol. Exactly 15 degrees. But his heart wasn't in it, and he suspected Camilla knew. Halfway through the dinner, James was approached by an aide he didn't recognize. Young, nervous, clearly new to palace work. Lieutenant Hartley, the aide asked quietly. Yes, Princess Catherine requests your presence in the East Gallery. She needs additional security for her exit route. James frowned. That didn't make sense. Exit routes were planned weeks in advance. Security was already in place. Why would she need him specifically? Are you sure? He asked. The aide nodded quickly. Yes, sir. She asked for you by name. James's pulse quickened. This could be a trap. A test to see if he'd abandon his post for Kate. Evidence of favoritism that could be used against him, but it could also be legitimate. He made a decision. I'll need authorization from my commanding officer. There's no time, the aide insisted. She's leaving in 5 minutes. Please, sir. James studied the young man's face. He looked genuinely anxious. Not calculating or deceptive, just nervous. Lead the way, James said finally. They moved quickly through the service corridors, away from the dinner guests. The East Gallery was rarely used during events. It was a quiet space filled with older portraits and artifacts. When they arrived, Kate was standing alone, looking at a painting. No other guards, no staff. Just her. The aide disappeared immediately, leaving them alone. James's instincts screamed warning. This was wrong. Against protocol. Potentially career-ending, Kate turned to face him. Her expression was troubled. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I know this puts you in a difficult position. Ma'am, I shouldn't be here, I know. She took a breath. But I needed to speak with you, privately. James's mind raced. Every second he remained could be used against him. But leaving felt impossible too. What is this about, ma'am? Kate moved closer, her voice dropping even lower. I know what's happening to you. The reassignments. The isolation. It's because of me. Because of what you did at the memorial. I made that choice, ma'am. But you're paying the price for it, Kate said, pain in her eyes. And it's not fair. You showed kindness, and you're being punished. Welcome to palace life, James said before he could stop himself. Kate's expression shifted. Surprise, then something like understanding. You sound bitter. I sound honest, ma'am. They stood in the quiet gallery, surrounded by the faces of the long dead. James knew he should leave, should bow and exit, and report this entire conversation to his superiors. Instead, he spoke the truth again. They want me to regret what I did, he said quietly. To see it as a mistake? To promise never to show you special respect again? And do you? Kate asked. Regret it? James met her eyes directly. No, ma'am. I don't. Kate's breath caught. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. James turned instantly, his hand moving to his radio. Someone was approaching. Multiple someones. You need to go, James said urgently. Now. Different direction. Kate understood immediately. She moved toward a side door, her gown whispering against the floor. But before she left, she paused and looked back. "Thank you, James," she said softly, using his first name, breaking yet another rule. Then she was gone. The footsteps grew louder. James positioned himself in front of the main entrance. Standing at attention as if he'd been assigned there all along, Commander Walsh rounded the corner. Followed by two other officers, her eyes swept the empty gallery, then landed on James. "Lieutenant," she said coldly, "what are you doing here?" "I was informed Princess Catherine required additional security, ma'am," James replied, his voice steady. "By whom?" "An aide, ma'am." "I didn't catch his name." Walsh's eyes narrowed. "There was no such request. No such aid." James's stomach dropped. He'd been set up. "I received the information in good faith, ma'am. I responded appropriately." "You abandoned your post," Walsh said sharply. "Without authorization. To be alone with a member of the royal family. I was responding to a security concern." "You were following her," Walsh accused. "This is exactly the behavior we've been monitoring. This obsession with Princess Catherine—" "It's not true, ma'am, isn't it?" Walsh stepped closer. "You bow deeper for her. You speak with her privately. You abandon your assigned post to be where she is. This has gone beyond protocol violation, Lieutenant. This is bordering on inappropriate fixation." James felt anger surge through him. "I have never behaved inappropriately. It's not for you to decide." Walsh gestured to the other officers. "Lieutenant Hartley, you're suspended from duty, effective immediately. Pending a full investigation." The words hit James like a physical blow. His career. 8 years of service. Everything he'd worked for, gone. Because he'd shown kindness to someone who deserved it. James was escorted from the palace that night. Not roughly, but firmly. He was allowed to collect his personal items from his locker while an officer watched. His security credentials were confiscated. His uniform would be returned later, they said. He walked out of the palace gates as a civilian for the first time in 8 years. The night air was cold. Traffic hummed in the distance. The world outside the palace walls continued as if nothing had changed. But for James, everything had changed. He took the train home in silence, still wearing his dress uniform because he hadn't been allowed time to change. Other passengers glanced at him curiously. A royal guard out of place. Out of context, when he finally reached his apartment, James sat in darkness for hours. Not thinking. Not feeling. Just existing in the hollow space where his career used to be. His phone buzzed repeatedly. Messages from other guards. News traveled fast. Some expressed sympathy. Others asked what had happened. A few suggested he'd brought it on himself. Marcus called. James let it go to voicemail. Rachel called next. James almost didn't answer, but he knew she'd keep trying. "I heard," she said gently. "Are you okay?" "No." "What can I do?" "Nothing," James said flatly. "There's nothing anyone can do." "Come stay with us for a while," Rachel offered. "Get away from London. Clear your head and do what?" James asked bitterly. "I've spent 8 years doing one thing. I don't know how to do anything else." "That's not true." "It feels true." Rachel was quiet for a moment. "James, you did the right thing. I know it doesn't feel like it now, but you did. The right thing cost me everything." "Not everything," Rachel said firmly. "It cost you a job. That's not everything. You still have your integrity, your conscience, your humanity. Those matter more." After they hung up, James stared at the ceiling. Rachel was right, in theory. But integrity didn't pay bills. Conscience didn't build careers. Humanity didn't erase the hollow ache of losing something you'd devoted your life to. He fell asleep on the couch, still in his uniform, and dreamed of corridors he'd never walk again. The next morning, James woke to find his phone flooded with messages. But these were different. Not from guards or family. From reporters, his story had leaked. Royal guards suspended for showing. Preference to Princess Kate Palace, security officer, accused of inappropriate behavior. The guard who bowed to deep. The headlines varied. But the narrative was consistent. James was being painted as obsessed, unprofessional, someone who'd let personal feelings compromise his duty. Some articles were sympathetic. They questioned why showing respect was being treated as a crime. They highlighted Kate's popularity versus Camilla's more complicated public image. They suggested James was being punished for recognizing what everyone else already knew. But other articles were brutal. They implied James had stalked Kate, that he'd abandoned posts to be near her, that his behavior had been creepy rather than respectful. None of them had the full story. None of them understood what had actually happened. James turned off his phone. For 3 days, he barely left his apartment. He ignored calls, avoided news, tried to figure out what came next. On the 4th day, someone knocked on his door. James opened it to find Marcus standing in the hallway. "Dressed in civilian clothes? You look terrible," Marcus said. "Thanks. Can I come in?" James stepped aside. Marcus entered, glancing around the sparse apartment. "You need food. And sunlight. Probably a shower, too." "I'm fine." "You're not fine." Marcus sat on the couch. "But that's okay. You don't have to be." James remained standing. "Why are you here?" "Because you're drowning," Marcus said simply. "And because what happened to you is wrong. A lot of us know it. We're just not brave enough to say it out loud." "Brave or stupid?" James asked bitterly. "Sometimes they're the same thing." Marcus leaned forward. "Listen to me. You're not the villain here. The system is broken. It punishes people for being human, for showing emotion, for making choices based on conscience instead of blind protocol. Telling me that doesn't change anything," James said. "No, but this might." Marcus pulled out his phone and showed James a video. It had been posted to social media by someone who'd attended the memorial service. The angle was distant, but clear enough. It showed James bowing to Camilla, then Kate passing, and James bowing deeper. The difference was subtle, but visible. The caption read, "When even the guards know who deserves respect." The video had millions of views, thousands of comments, most of them supportive of James, critical of the palace, celebrating his quiet act of recognition. "You've become a symbol," Marcus said, "whether you wanted to or not." James stared at the video, his emotions churning. A symbol of what? Of what a lot of people feel but won't say. That Kate represents something better, something more genuine, and that institutions that punish decency are institutions that need to change. James handed the phone back. "Symbols don't pay rent," no, Marcus agreed. "But they do open doors. You've got job offers coming in. Private security firms. Media interviews. Even a book deal, I heard." James shook his head. "I don't want to be famous. I just wanted to do my job." "Your job was taken from you unfairly," Marcus said. "Now you get to decide what comes next. And that's actually a kind of freedom." After Marcus left, James thought about those words, freedom. He'd spent 8 years in rigid structure, following orders, maintaining perfect neutrality, living within carefully drawn lines. Now the lines were gone. The structure had collapsed, and he had no idea what to do with that. Over the next week, James started receiving mail. Letters forwarded from his old palace address. Emails sent to accounts he'd forgotten existed. Most were from ordinary people, thanking him, sharing their own stories of being punished for doing the right thing, expressing support for Kate, criticizing the institution that had rejected him. One letter stood out. It was handwritten on expensive paper. "No return address, dear. Dear Lieutenant Hartley, I cannot formally acknowledge this correspondence, but I wanted you to know that your actions did not go unnoticed or unappreciated. The kindness you showed during a difficult moment meant more than you can imagine. What happened to you is unjust. I wish I had the power to change it, but please know that your integrity and courage have not been diminished by their response. If anything, they've been proven. I hope you find a path forward that honors the good man you clearly are, with gratitude and respect." C. James read the letter 3 times. He didn't need a signature to know who'd written it. Kate had reached out. Not officially. Not in a way that could be traced or used against her, but she'd found a way to let him know she cared, that she saw what he'd sacrificed, that it mattered. James folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. Then he made a decision. He couldn't change what had happened. Couldn't undo the suspension or erase the headlines or reclaim his old life. But he could move forward. He could choose what came next. And for the first time in days, that thought didn't terrify him. It gave him hope. 3 months after his suspension, James stood in a television studio preparing for an interview. He'd turned down dozens of media requests, but this one felt different. The interviewer was known for thoughtful journalism. For asking real questions instead of chasing sensationalism, James had decided it was time to tell his story. Not to attack the palace. Not to seek revenge. But to speak a truth that too many people were afraid to say out loud. The interview went live. James sat across from the host, wearing a simple suit, his military bearings still evident despite the civilian clothes. "Why did you agree to speak now?" the host asked. "Because silence felt like agreement," James said. "And I don't agree with what happened. Not just to me, but to the principle behind it. The principle? That showing genuine respect is somehow wrong. That treating people as individuals instead of titles is a breach of duty. That we should serve institutions rather than the people within them." The interview lasted 40 minutes. James spoke carefully but honestly. About the memorial service. About Kate's humanity in a place that often felt inhuman. About the pressure to treat all royals as equally deserving when clearly some worked harder, cared more, and represented better values. He never attacked Camilla personally. Never made it about comparing to women. Instead, he talked about systems. About how rigid protocols could crush the very things they were supposed to protect. Dignity, respect, human connection. The interview went viral. Clips spread across social media. Op-eds were written, arguing both sides. Polls showed overwhelming public support for James. Criticism of how the palace had handled the situation, but James didn't care about the publicity. He'd said what he needed to say. Now he could move on. 2 weeks later, James started a new job. A private security firm specializing in protecting charitable organizations and humanitarian workers. The work was meaningful. The hours were reasonable. And most importantly, he was judged by his actions, not his ability to bow at precise angles. He was happy. Or at least, he was healing. Then, 6 months after his suspension, something unexpected happened. James received a phone call from an unknown number. He almost didn't answer, assuming it was another reporter. But something made him pick up. "Mr. Hartley," an unfamiliar voice said. "This is David Chen, private secretary to the Princess of Wales." James's breath caught. "Yes. Her Royal Highness would like to meet with you. Privately, if you're willing." James sat down slowly. Why, she didn't specify. She simply asked if you'd be open to a conversation. No cameras. Just a private meeting? James thought about Kate's letter, about the memorial service, about everything that had happened since. He said quietly, "I'd be willing." The meeting was arranged for the following week at a private estate outside London. Secure. Discreet. James arrived at the specified time and was led through a beautiful garden to a conservatory. Filled with plants and sunlight, Kate was waiting inside. Dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, she looked different than she did at official events. Younger, more relaxed. She stood when he entered. "James, thank you for coming, Your Highness," James said, bowing instinctively. Kate smiled gently. "You don't have to do that anymore. You're not a palace guard." "Old habits," James said. They sat across from each other. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Kate leaned forward. "I wanted to apologize," she said. "What happened to you is my fault." "It wasn't, it was," Kate interrupted firmly. "You showed me kindness, and the system punished you for it. That's not right, and I've carried guilt about it ever since." James shook his head. "I made my choices. I don't regret them, even though they cost you your career. Even then, Kate's eyes filled with emotion. Why? Why would you sacrifice so much for a gesture most people didn't even notice? James thought carefully about his answer. Because in that moment, at that service, you weren't Princess Catherine. You were just a woman grieving, and you needed kindness more than protocol. Responding to that need felt more important than following rules. A tear slipped down Kate's cheek. She wiped it away quickly. You saw me? As a person? That's so rare in this world. Maybe that's the problem, James said quietly. Too many people see titles instead of humans. They talked for over an hour. About the palace. About pressure and expectations. About the cost of living in a system that demanded perfection while denying humanity. Kate shared things she'd never said publicly. About feeling isolated. About fighting battles no one saw. About trying to change an institution from within, while that institution resisted every effort at change. James listened, understanding in a way few others could. He'd lived inside that machine. He knew how it ground people down. As their conversation drew to a close, Kate stood. I want you to know something. What you did mattered. Not just the bow, but everything after. Speaking honestly in that interview. Refusing to let them silence you. You've inspired more people than you know. I just told the truth, James said. That's exactly my point. Kate smiled. Truth is revolutionary in places built on carefully maintained fictions. She walked him to the door. Before he left, she placed a hand on his arm. If you ever need anything, she said softly, and I mean anything. You know how to reach me? James nodded to move to speak. He left the estate feeling lighter than he had in months. Not because meeting Kate had solved anything, but because it had confirmed what he'd believed all along. He'd made the right choice. Over the following year, his security firm grew. He trained other guards who'd left the palace seeking more meaningful work. He spoke occasionally about institutional reform, the importance of treating people with genuine respect. He never spoke to Kate again. Their paths never crossed. But he followed her work from a distance, watched her continue fighting battles most people never saw, saw her succeed despite constant obstacles. And sometimes, when he saw footage of her at official events, he'd notice how she interacted with staff, how she always stopped to listen, always remembered names, always showed genuine kindness. He'd smile, because he knew those weren't empty gestures. They were acts of quiet rebellion. Small ways of being human in a place that demanded something less. One evening, 2 years after his suspension, James was having dinner with Rachel and her family in Edinburgh. His niece, Emma, was asking about his time at the palace. Uncle James, she said, do you miss it? Being a guard? James thought about the question. About the corridors he'd walked, the ceremonies he'd attended, the rigid protocols he'd followed. Sometimes, he admitted, I miss parts of it. The sense of purpose, the discipline, the history, but you don't want to go back? Emma pressed. James shook his head. No, because going back would mean becoming someone I'm not anymore. Someone who bows the same way to everyone, regardless of whether they deserve it. That doesn't seem fair, Emma said. It's not, James agreed. But fairness isn't always the point of systems like that. Control is... Rachel looked at her brother with pride. You've changed. Grown. I've remembered who I was before the uniform, James said. Sometimes you have to lose something to realize you were losing yourself trying to keep it. Later that night, lying in the guest room of Rachel's house, James thought about his journey. From the memorial service to this moment, from rigid guard to free man, it hadn't been easy. There had been dark days, moments of regret. Times when he'd wondered if the cost had been too high, but lying there, listening to the quiet sounds of a house filled with love and laughter. James knew the truth. He'd traded security for authenticity, position for principle. And while the world might judge that as failure, he knew it was anything but. Because the day he'd bowed deeper for Kate, he'd made a choice. Not just about respect for a princess, but about respect for himself. He'd chosen to be human in a place that demanded he be a statue, and that choice, with all its consequences, had set him free. The last thing James thought before falling asleep was something Kate said during their private meeting, something he'd carried with him ever since. Courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about doing the right thing despite the fear. And that's exactly what you did, he had. And he'd do it again, every single time. Because some things matter more than careers, more than positions, more than fitting into systems that demand you diminish yourself. Things like integrity, like kindness, like recognizing another person's humanity and responding to it. Regardless of the cost, those things couldn't be taken from him. They couldn't be suspended or investigated or judged by committees. They were his forever. And that was worth more than any uniform had ever been. James smiled in the darkness and closed his eyes. He'd made the right choice, and he was finally truly free.